But before I describe what happened, let me spend a few minutes summarizing the facts of Jewish involvement in the slave trade. What precisely was the nature of the Jewish involvement in the African slave trade? The Jewish involvement in the African slave trade begins, as far as I can tell, long before the actual slave trade across the Atlantic itself. The transatlantic slave trade has its immediate origins around about 1441, when Portuguese sailors landed on the West African coast and kidnapped a few Africans, brought them back to Europe. Africans were brought back to Europe, to Portugal and to Spain as part of that particular trade for several years. Columbus, of course, arrived in the Americas in 1492, approximately half a century later. In 1502, the first Africans were brought to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is where the transatlantic slave trade begins, and many Americans don't know that. But for over 100 years before Africans were brought as slaves to this country, the United States of America, Africans were being brought across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, to places like Hispaniola, the island which today is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and to other places as well. So it seems to me that Jewish involvement then in that transatlantic slave trade precedes by many, many years, perhaps by 1,000 years, the actual beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And let me explain. It seems to me that the most important theoretical underpinning for that transatlantic slave trade was what has come to be known in many quarters as the Hamitic myth. Some people call it the curse of Ham story. When the slave trade developed, beginning in 1441 and for hundreds of years thereafter, people who prosecuted that trade looked around for intellectual justification, for rationalizations, for pretexts, if you will. And a variety of pretexts were advanced to justify the slave trade, to allow people to sleep well at night, for their consciences to be clear. One justification was that Africans were heathens. They weren't Christian, they were heathens, and therefore it was all right to enslave heathens. It would not be all right to enslave one's Christian brother, but it would be okay. It would be morally justifiable to enslave a heathen. That was one kind of rationale that was advanced to justify the slave trade. Another rationale was that Africans were less than human. Africans were devoid of reason, could not reason, were a subspecies of creature. They weren't human, and therefore, again, whereas there might have been some moral opprobrium attached to enslaving one's fellow human beings, in the case of Africans, since they weren't quite human, that kind of treatment of Africans was okay. The most important, however, of all of these rationales that was advanced to try to justify the slave trade was the question of this Hamitic myth. That is, the notion that Africans were cursed by God himself, that Africans had been cursed by God, that God had decreed in his wisdom a very long time ago that Africans would be forever the hewers of wood and the drawers of water for other races. The authority for this idea was said to reside in the book of Genesis, in the story in the book of Genesis. Now, there's a story in the book of Genesis, and there's an interpretation of that story that allowed it to be used to justify African slavery, and they're two different things. The story in Genesis is in Genesis. It's been in the Bible ever since. But the sort of spin that was put on that story that enabled it to become the basis for the Hamitic myth actually comes out of the Talmud, the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Somewhere around 500 AD or thereabouts, the Babylonian Talmud. Let me just describe the difference between the story as it appears in the Bible and the story as it was spun in the Talmud. According to the Bible, Noah, after the flood, apparently had a vineyard someplace, and he partook of the wine that was produced out of his vineyard. He got himself drunk one night, went into his tent, took his clothes off, as people often do when they get drunk. And according to the biblical story, he had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham apparently entered the area where his father was lying in his drunken, naked stupor, and Ham in an act of disrespect, gazed upon his father's nakedness. And apparently went back outside and informed his two other brothers of his father's condition. According to the biblical story, the two other brothers then came inside the tent or wherever, and out of respect for their father, they kind of backed into the tent. They would not look directly at him in his naked condition. They backed into the tent. They covered him with some kind of a garment. And according to the biblical story, when Noah revived, when he, arose from his drunken stupor and realized what had happened, he then cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his descendants forever, and said that they would be the servants of the descendants of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure how come, but somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the notion that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and Shem was the progenitor of the Asian race, and Japheth was the progenitor of the European race. So Noah had three sons of three different races. And he cursed his African son and their descendants, and said that those descendants would be the slaves, the servants of the Asian branch of the family, and also the European branch of the family forever. And that's as far as the biblical story goes. The Talmud, which of course, my understanding of the Talmud, I'm no expert in the Talmud, but my understanding is that the Talmud consists of interpretations, what they call glosses, on various biblical stories. And these glosses or interpretations or spins are supposed to give people who subscribe to the Judaic religion a sort of an authoritative guide as to how to interpret the biblical stories and whatnot. So what the Talmud did then, the Talmud came along, the Babylonian Talmud, around about 500 or so AD, and proceeded to spin this biblical story for reasons that are unknown to me. But Ham, again, was said to be the progenitor of the African race. Now, interestingly enough, I've read someplace that early Christians also accepted this notion of Ham being some sort of progenitor of the African race. But apparently, in the Christian tradition, the kind of, overtly racist implications of that fact didn't develop in the same way as it developed in the Judaic tradition. According to the Talmud, Ham was the original African, and when God, through Noah, cursed Ham and his son Canaan and all his descendants, he was in fact cursing the African race. Now, this was the unique new element to the story that the Talmud originated. That the curse on Ham and Canaan was not only a curse on an individual and his family, but it was a curse on a race. So here, this is the contribution then of the Talmud. That God, through Noah, cursed the African race. And the Talmud proceeded to embellish the story in the most delightful, should I say, ways. For example, the Talmud said that there was ample proof that God was in fact cursing the African race. It said, for example, that because Ham had gazed upon Noah's nakedness in the dark of night, that the African race was henceforth turned black, so that the blackness of the African became a sort of a visible indication of that curse. The Talmud said that because it was dark at night when Ham entered that tent and looked upon his father's nakedness, he had to open his eyes, he had to buck his eyes, as they say in America, to see his father in the darkness. And that's why Africans had big eyes. The Talmud said, and I'm going to quote all this exactly in a minute. I'm not making this up. It sounds incredible, but I'm actually paraphrasing a gentleman by the name of Harold Brackman, a man who worked until recently for the Simon Wiesenthal Center of all agencies. He wrote all of this in his dissertation. And it might not surprise you to discover that once people like myself began quoting what this guy Brackman wrote, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. And that is that Brackman denied he had ever written this stuff. This stuff is in Brackman's PhD dissertation. It's called The Ebb and Flow of History. Anybody here can easily read it. You can get it in any library. If they don't have it, they'll get it for you interlibrary loans. It's called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a PhD dissertation. I think in the history department at UCLA, 1977, by Harold D. Brackman, who I believe up to a couple of years ago, maybe even now, is or was until recently a functionary of the Simon Wiesenthal, or is it Wiesenthal Center. But despite the fact that his writings are clearly in the public record, that anybody, an undergrad student can access this stuff and check it for themselves, once the story got out, he quickly denied it ever written this. This man actually wrote letters to the New York Times. I believe I have the actual, footnotes here in the Jewish Onslaught concerning all this. This man wrote letters to the New York Times. He wrote a slew of letters to black publications all over this country, denying all of this stuff, even though it's right there on the record. So I'm, using very good evidence here when I paraphrase what he's saying. Brackman tells us that because, and here it gets to be totally hilarious. Now, these Jewish rabbis, the sages, they call them, wise men who put together this Talmud, they actually invented. I mean, they sort of elaborated on the biblical story. It's like a jazz musician who improvises. Well, they improvised on the story. They did a whole elaborate improvisation in the story. And somehow, Lord knows how come, but they came up with the notion that Ham, when he went into that tent and looked upon his naked father Noah, that Ham buggered his father. He had anal intercourse with his father. And because he had anal intercourse with his father, that's the reason, and here I'm citing Brackman, that's the reason why part of the curse was to give black men large sexual organs. So all of this was part of the curse. The black skin, the big eyes, even the kinky hair too, big sexual organs, all of this. So, as amazing as this may seem, this transpired 1,000 years before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And when the slave trade came into being, this notion of the Hamitic curse was revived, and it became, both for Jews and for Christians, it became the most pervasive of all the attempts to rationalize that slave trade. Let me quote the exact words of Harold Brackman, lest you suspect that I'm making this up. I'm quoting here from Harold Brackman, the dissertation I mentioned a minute ago, The Ebb and Flow of History. Quote, "There is no denying," this is on page 34 in case anybody who has the book feels like reading along with me. I know several of you have the book on it. This is on page 34 in the middle of the page. Second new paragraph. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source." And listen to how unequivocal he is here. It was the first, the very first. In other words, this is Brackman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center acknowledging that the Talmud was the place that invented the story of the Hamitic curse. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic content into the episode." Here he is referring to the episode of Ham looking upon his father's nakedness. He goes on to suggest that these early sages, some of them, impose this homosexual sort of spin onto the story. Quote, he says, Rab is one of these sages. He says, Rab maintained that Ham had unmanned Noah. So Ham, according to this sage, had actually castrated his father. While Samuel is some other sage, Samuel claimed that he had buggered him as well. Both unmanned him and buggered him. Now, how this arose out of the biblical story, I'll never understand. Let me continue to quote from Brackman here in his dissertation. Quote, he is discussing here various slightly diverging, variants of this myth. He goes on to say, quote, "The more important version of the myth," that's the Hamitic myth, however, "ingeniously ties in the origins of blackness and of other real and imagined Negroid traits with Noah's curse itself. According to it," that's according to this most popular version of the Hamitic myth, "according to it, Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly. This is in the Talmud. Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes. So if you ever wondered about the origin of the kinky hair and the red eyes of black folk, here you have it. Because your lips jested at my exposure, theirs shall swell. That's why black folks have thick lips. And because you neglected my nakedness, they, that is your children, the children of Ham and Canaan, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see. So there you have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to African folk. So the Hamitic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade. Some years after the Babylonian Talmud, sometime in the Middle Ages, a man who I believe they consider to be perhaps one of the greatest philosophers ever, a man by the name of Maimonides, actually also contributed to that notion of Africans being subhuman when in his famous book, Guide to the Perplexed, when he, Maimonides, suggested again that African people were less than human, that they were somewhere between monkeys and human beings. This is Maimonides, a man who is one of the most revered of all of these Jewish sages. So by the time then that the slave trade came along, then, there was this tradition which had been floating around Europe, and it was seized upon then by the slave traders, Jews and Gentiles alike, as a basic rationale. There were other areas, in which the Jewish presence was very manifest. For example, although I don't know a whole lot about this aspect of it, but my understanding is that Jews were in fact very prominent as slave traders, in the centuries prior to the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. My understanding is that Jews, for many years sold Muslim slaves to Christians and sold Christian slaves to Muslims, and they were sort of accepted as the slave middlemen by both sides. And this is, a long time before the Atlantic slave trade came about. The earliest multinational corporation involved in the Atlantic slave trade was something called the Dutch West India Company. And again, it often surprises people to discover that even in this early period, globalization was already a very, fairly entrenched phenomenon. The slave trade was a great example of globalization. Here you had the Dutch West India Company, out of Holland, of course, which went to West Africa. They had their own private army. They established forts on the West African coast. They had their own fleet of ships and so on. They had their own administrators. Sometimes they would govern areas. They had their own governors, administrators, and whatnot. They were almost like it was almost like colonization, via private enterprise. It was like privatized colonization, and all of this, of course, transpired with the sanction of European governments. These were like surrogate governments almost. These chartered companies, as they were often called. So the Dutch West India Company in the 1600s then was the pioneer in this kind of multinational, globalized prosecution of the slave trade. And apparently a large number of the shareholders, the stockholders in this Dutch West India Company were Jews. The Jews had been chased out of Portugal and Spain. They had been chased out of all kinds of places. They found some respite from their wanderings in Holland. They became an influential factor in Holland. And I've seen a variety of figures. This too is an area of some controversy. I've seen estimates varying from 25% to 50% concerning the stake of Jewish stockholders in the Dutch West India Company. But suffice it to say that they were an important element in the Dutch West India Company, which was the preeminent entity carrying on the slave trade in the early period. The Dutch West India Company was responsible for importing, the earliest slaves to places like Brazil, to some parts of the Caribbean, either directly or indirectly, I think, to this country as well in a very early period in the 17th century. In many areas in the Americas, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. In Brazil, for example, in the 17th century, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. They owned a large number of the plantations. They were often very importantly positioned in other aspects, not necessarily the plantation aspects, but things like, say, the importation of slaves, things like the warehousing of slaves, things like the auctioning of slaves, things like the provisioning of slaves, things like manning slave ships, provisioning slave ships. In New England, for example, at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, rum became a major economic venture in New England, places like Providence, Rhode Island, places like Boston and so on. And rum was a major factor in the slave trade because rum was one of the major items of trade, one of the major items that slave ships carried when they went to West Africa to trade and exchange for slaves and so on. And I believe that at one point all the rum distilleries in Boston were owned by Jews. I think there was something like 18 or something like that rum distilleries. So in all of these areas, both directly and in terms of ancillary industries feeding the slave trade, Jews were very, very important. Apart from Brazil, Jews were again dominant factors in many other parts of the area. For example, in Curacao, a Dutch island in the Caribbean. The majority of folks involved in the slave trade in Curacao were Jews. At one point in Suriname, which again was a Dutch colony right next to Brazil in South America, Jews were again a very important part of the slave trade in Suriname. There was an English soldier by the name of John Stedman who went to Suriname in the late 1700s as part of a mercenary force raised by the Dutch to try to fight against the maroon slaves. Those were the escaped slaves who established an independent existence in the interior and gave the slave regime a lot of trouble. And Stedman wrote a very fascinating book concerning his experiences in Suriname, and there are several references in Stedman's book to the presence of Jewish slave owners and so on. There was one large plantation area in Suriname called Jew Savannah. Jew Savannah. And according to Stedman, the Jews were very often the most cruel of the slave owners. They played a very prominent role in torturing slaves and so on. He has several little vignettes that he mentions in there concerning the kind of cruelties that were meted out to slaves by both Jewish men and women. There's one case he describes there of a maroon slave leader, a man called Jolicoeur, French Jolicoeur, beautiful heart. Don't know where he got that name from, Jolicoeur. But apparently Jolicoeur, again, was a rebellious slave. He led a slave uprising. And on one occasion, apparently, the Maroons were fighting against, some of these people from Jew Savannah. And according to Stedman, they captured a Jewish slave owner named Schultz. And apparently Schultz was the man that Jolicoeur, the slave owner that Jolicoeur had escaped from as a young boy. And Jolicoeur remembered that this guy Schultz had apparently ravaged his mother and so on. And Stedman describes a very, very, very harsh vengeance that was wrought by Jolicoeur on Schultz. He flayed him, cut his skin off, then used his skin to keep the powder dry, the powder for his cannon or whatever, and used his head to play football with. Jews were also very prominently present in non-Dutch parts of the Caribbean, places like Barbados, places like Jamaica, St. Thomas, and many of the other islands as well. There's been a big debate that has arisen concerning whether Jews were the dominant element or not, or whether they were even an important element. But much of that discussion has taken place in the context of the United States of America. In the U.S., it may not be correct to say that Jews were as dominant in the slave trade as they were in parts of, say, the Caribbean or Central America. Nevertheless, Jews were an important part of the slave trade in this country, in the US of A, anyway. In fact, in the US of A, Jews apparently played a role in the slave trade that was greater than the numbers in the overall population would suggest. Just as in 1992, a study done based on the Forbes magazine list of the richest people in America for 1992. A study based on that list discovered that something like 33% of the billionaires in the US of A were Jews, based on the Forbes list of 1992, at a time when Jews claimed to be 2.5% of the United States population. So just as in 1992, they were overrepresented in the high echelons of this country, just so during the slave trade, even though their numbers may have been relatively small, and many of the people who have tried to refute, the suggestion that Jews were prominently involved in the slave trade in this country, many of those people have put forward figures suggesting that Jews were only a very minute portion of the overall American population. Yes, they were a very small percentage of the American population, but that has nothing to do with their role in the slave trade, the importance of their role. The role was much greater than their numbers in the overall population would suggest. As a matter of fact, a Jewish historian has done a study of the 1830 census in the South and has come up with the conclusion that something like 75% of Jewish households in the South in this country in 1830 owned slaves, whereas the percentage for white households generally was only something like 36%. So the Jews were approximately twice as likely as non-Jews, as the white population, to own slaves in this country in the South in 1830. So again, we're talking here about, proportions rather than absolute figures. Some of the most important slave ship owners in colonial America were Jews. Perhaps the best known of these is a man called Aaron Lopez. I noticed that many of these persons had Spanish or Portuguese sounding last names, and that's because they were Sephardic Jews. When this whole question arose, around my involvement in all this, many Jews were heard to say that there were no Jews in America prior to the 1880s. In fact, Nathan Glazer, a very famous academic out of Harvard University who should know better, he actually wrote that there's no way that Jews could be responsible for the slave trade in America, since there were no Jews here, he said, before 1880. Of course, there were European Jews here in the 19th century before 1880, German Jews and so on. But there were Sephardic Jews here from the very beginning. From the 17th century, there were Sephardic Jews coming in here to New York and later to other places. So hence the Spanish-sounding names like Nunez, names like Lopez, names like Castro, interestingly enough, names like Ferreira, Herrera, Gomez. All of these names, interestingly enough, suggested Jewish origin in colonial times. As somebody was saying to me yesterday, you could usually get a hint of their Jewishness from their first names. It was you, okay. The last name might be Gomez or Nunez or Castro, but the first name might be Jacob or David or something like that. Aaron. So Aaron Lopez was out of Newport, Rhode Island. He was one of the largest slave ship owners in colonial America. This man had a fleet of ships for many years. He sent his ships to West Africa. They traveled from West Africa to the Caribbean, to Barbados, to Jamaica, St. Thomas, places like that. He had members of his family situated in the Caribbean. He had a whole network going on. And he brought slaves back here as well. Many of his slaves helped to build some famous synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island in colonial times. Despite the fact that, by the way, Jews were also involved in other aspects of the trade. My time is running out, so I'm going to be quick here. For example, they were involved again in provisioning slaves here in this country, as they were in other areas as well. Providing the kind of coarse cloth that slaves wore, things like that. They had a hand in providing the kinds of restraints and handcuffs and chains and padlocks and those kinds of things that were used to sort of enforce servitude of the Africans as well. Interestingly enough, despite the prominence of Jews in this African slave trade in this country, in the US of A, their prominence in the African slave trade was not matched by a similar prominence in the abolitionist movement. In fact, some of the Christian abolitionists noted this apparent contradiction. In fact, let me quote you here a very interesting statement put out by Christian abolitionists. This is 1853. It's from the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society report, 1853. Quote, "The Jews of the United States have never taken steps any steps, whatever, with regard to the slavery question. As citizens, they deem it their policy to have everyone choose whichever side he may deem best to promote his own interests and the welfare of his country, etc., etc., etc. This statement concludes as follows, quote, "The objects of so much mean prejudice and unrighteous oppression as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, it would seem, more than any other denomination, ought to be the enemies of caste and friends of universal freedom." Such, however, was not the case. There were very few and far between as far as the abolitionist movement was concerned. So this then is the reality of Jewish involvement in the slave trade. And that's the reality that I faced then in 1993 when I stumbled into this controversy simply by exposing my students to the fact that Jews, like everybody else, had been involved. And of course, I did not deny the involvement of anybody else. I did not even deny the involvement of African collaborators. And for years I had taught Christian involvement. And up to now, I'm still somewhat surprised that everybody else, seems willing to acknowledge their involvement in the trade. But for some reason, this is the only group that not only refuses to acknowledge their involvement, but becomes, very, 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 very upset when that involvement is mentioned. I won't have time to go into my particular situation. It's all here in the Jewish onslaught. I'll just say very briefly before I wrap up, I was just told I have about 3 more minutes left. But this controversy assumed enormous proportions. I'm still surprised. Here was something as simple as my teaching this information, which is all well documented. The book that I was using, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, put out by the Nation of Islam, that book relies almost 100% on Jewish sources. But what is interesting, though, is that even though the Jewish academics and authoritative sources like the Encyclopedia, Judaica, even though these sort of academic, esoteric Jewish sources were quite forthcoming in acknowledging their role in the slave trade, the popular Jewish press and the popular Jewish populace, I guess, many of them were either unaware of all this or refused to believe it. I remember some Jewish alumni writing into the to the Wellesley College Alumni Magazine, suggesting that my teaching, the Jewish involvement in the slave trade, was akin to suspending the rules of grammar in an English class. The end result of all this is that the role of Jews in the slave trade, something which was unknown to many folks prior to 1993, something which was largely unknown to me, because of the hullabaloo created by the Jewish media and so on, I think that has, in a sense, had an effect that they perhaps did not anticipate. And that is that something which was in fact a secret relationship is no longer secret. The whole world is now aware of the fact, thanks to the hullabaloo created by the Jewish media, of the Jewish involvement in the slave trade. And even though there has been an incredible effort since 1993 on the part of the Jewish media to sort of counterattack. For example, the Amistad movie was part of that counterattack. The Amistad movie very subtly suggested that Africans were the ones responsible for their own enslavement. The Amistad movie, put out by Steven Spielberg, actually had an African slave. Imagine this. Steven Spielberg actually had an African slave in the Amistad movie saying, I did not see the movie, by the way, I refused to see it, but I was told that Spielberg actually had an African slave in this movie saying that he was so sorry for the great suffering that, the Jews had gone through, and whatnot. That nobody in the world, this was an African slave. A man who was on death row, in jail, fighting for his life as an African slave. And Spielberg has this man saying that he had just read the Bible, and these folks had suffered so much, etc., etc. Nobody in the world had suffered as much as they had. The whole question of late of an alleged slave trade in the Sudan. Now, there may indeed be a Muslim slave trade in the Sudan. There may, I know, it doesn't bother me one way or the other. But the whole attempt to elevate this into a new great anti-slavery crusade, that too is one of the the means by which the Jewish establishment has tried to kind of cover up, their own involvement in the slave trade. I don't know how many books on the slave trade have been published by Jews in the last 6-7 years. I've lost count, but it could easily be a dozen. That they keep just churning out these books. But the more noise they make, the more people become aware of the fact that, that there is a Jewish involvement in the slave trade. So I think that to a large extent, I think they've kind of shot themselves in the foot this time around. They have let the genie out of the bottle. I don't know how they'll ever get that genie back in the bottle. I don't think they'll find a way. So let me again end right here by thanking you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, David Irving.
What's up, my brothers and sisters, and thank you very much for this beautiful occasion. Yes, it is indeed true that Jews invented the Hamitic myth, whereby it was said that Ham, the son of Noah, was cursed in the book of Genesis. And somehow it was said that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and that all Africans would be cursed and enslaved for time immemorial because of this so-called biblical curse on Ham. We now know that it was Jewish scholars who invented the story of the Hamitic myth, which has plagued black people from that point on. Yes, it is true. We now know that Jews were very importantly involved in the slave trade in medieval times, both, as Professor Clark has said, in the East, in the Arabic areas, and also in Europe. That is even before our African slave trade to the Americas. Yes, it is true, as we now know, the Jews were the ones who invented what came to be known as white slavery, whereby Jewish entrepreneurs in Europe in the late 19th century prostituted their own Jewish women, sent them around the world as prostitutes, what came to be known as white slavery. Yes, it is true, as we now know, the Jews were heavily invested in the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company, that company which was a private corporation doing the job of colonizing, which was responsible in large measure for the African slave trade. The Dutch West India Company that owned the Elmina Fort in what is now Ghana. The Dutch West India Company that brought slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, to South America. The same Dutch West India Company that brought the first slaves to New York, when it was still New Amsterdam. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the Jews were the major element in the slave trade in Brazil in the 1600s, in Suriname, in Curacao, in Barbados, in Jamaica. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the two largest single shipments of slaves coming into this country in the 18th century were on ships owned by Jews. It is true, as we now know, that Aaron Lopez, biggest slave ship owner in the United States of America, was a Jew. It is also true, as we now know, that all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island, in the era of the slave trade were owned by Jews. Rum, as we know, was a very important item in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that there was a higher per capita ownership of slaves in the United States of America by Jews than by white Gentiles. We now know from the 1830 census of the US of A that something like 75% of Jewish households own slaves, as opposed to just 30-odd% for the white population as a whole. All of this information is contained in the secret relationship between blacks and Jews. And all of this information is based on the work of Jewish historians. So how come that we have a situation, an amazing situation developing here, where the Jewish leadership in this country is trying to deny the undeniable? And the only reason why the Jewish leadership has been able to place itself into this untenable and indefensible position, it seems to me, is because they have become drunk with power. We have gotten into the habit of easy victories over our people. Professor Clark said no more easy victories. We have won some easy victories in the past, And they have become so drunk with the power coming out of those easy victories, and have become so arrogant and so conceited that they have come to the point now where they believe that they can in fact defend the indefensible. The Jeffries case has shown that the time has come to an end, that from now on they will be forced to deal on an intellectual level with an aroused black community. And once we force them to deal on an intellectual level, the Jeffries case has shown, and I hope that my case will show, that they cannot win. Jewish power over black institutions in this country is based in large measure on the apparent liberalism of Jews in relation to black people in the 20th century. And what this book does, by showing the Jewish role in slavery and the slave trade, it punctures that balloon, that liberal balloon. It shows that Jews were in fact not a liberal community as far as black people were concerned for most of the history of Africans in America. And so as soon as that balloon is punctured, the whole apparatus of Jewish power over black people, which rests on this alleged Jewish liberalism, then becomes in a very perilous situation. And that, to my mind, partially explains the frenetic, crazy, insane way in which the Jewish community has tried to defend the indefensible by trying to deny their involvement in the African slave trade. Now, Jewish liberalism, like I said, is a 20th century phenomenon. Apparent Jewish liberalism is a 20th century phenomenon. Clearly, they weren't liberals during the slave trade if 75% of the Jewish households had slaves, and if they owned the largest shipments of slaves coming to this country, and if they owned all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island. The major initial apparently liberal activity of the Jewish population in relation to African Americans was in the formation of the NAACP in 1909. Much of that claim to liberalism lies in the fact that many major influential Jewish persons were among the founders of the NAACP. Some of the founders of the NAACP were not only prominent Jews, but were actually leaders of the American Zionist movement. You had the leaders of the American Zionist movement founding the NAACP. Could you imagine if Marcus Garvey had founded the ADL? Would anybody have taken Marcus Garvey seriously as a Pan-Africanist if he had founded the American Jewish Committee? They would instantly have looked at his motivation for so doing. Now we have discovered what the motivation is. Even as I speak, for the last 2 or 3 months, amazing revelations have been coming out in the press. Revelations suggesting that Joel Spingarn, the Jewish chairman of the NAACP, was actually spying on his own black NAACP membership. Spying for US military intelligence. What kind of a liberal was that? Marcus Garvey, our most perceptive leader. Brother Ilombe was talking about Race First, but this is amazing. Race First, as Ilombe said, was written 20 years ago as a PhD dissertation. But in Race First, there's a quotation that goes something like this. And here Garvey is talking about white liberals. He didn't zero in on Jews per se, but he was talking about the white liberals in the NAACP, many of whom, as we know, were in fact Jews. And Garvey said that the white liberals were only about what he called disarming, disvisioning, and disambitioning the Negro, as he put it. He said that the white liberals were only about removing the African from the path of self-reliance and self-determination. And then Garvey went on to make a very significant statement. He said the liberals in the NAACP were nothing but spies. These are the exact words of Garvey, quote, spies for the rest of the white race, unquote. If one wants to really see the liberalism of the whites and Jews in the NAACP, one has to look not on the fact that they founded the NAACP, one has to look at their attitude towards Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In the UNIA, we had at the very same time the major organization in our history attempting to provide for us self-reliance and self-determination. And the white liberals, Jew and Gentile, in the NAACP targeted Marcus Garvey's effort at self-reliance as their major objective to attack. So here you find the real liberal agenda of the whites and Jews in the NAACP in the attitude to Marcus Garvey. The man, as has been said earlier, who sent Marcus Garvey to jail in his famous case in 1923 was Julian Mack. And Julian Mack wasn't only a Jew, he was also an influential member of the NAACP. At the beginning of the trial, Marcus Garvey and his lawyers asked Judge Mack to disqualify himself. Here was this man who was a member of the NAACP, which had been waging a campaign against Marcus Garvey, the Marcus Garvey must go campaign. Members of the very same NAACP had written, right around the time that Garvey was indicted, they had written a letter to the Attorney General of these United States, telling him that Garvey was a criminal, asking him to put Garvey in jail and or deport him. And here you had a representative of that very same organization sitting now in judgment over Marcus Garvey. And as Brother Ilombe said earlier, not only was Judge Mack a Jew, he was also a leader of the American Zionist movement. Over the years, many misguided people over the years have called Garvey a quote-unquote Negro Zionist. Nothing could be further from the truth. If Garvey was a quote-unquote Negro Zionist, then the Zionist judge would have let him off. You had a rare Zionist judge giving Garvey the highest possible fine, the longest possible term of imprisonment, and as if that wasn't enough, then charging him the entire costs of the trial, which was about 10 times the maximum fine. So that was a rare Zionist now dealing with the person who they call a Negro Zionist. And if you ever wanted any proof that there was nothing Zionist about Garvey's organization, here is the proof. During the Civil Rights Movement, especially the early phase of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, early 1960s, the Jewish claims to liberalism again came to the fore. The Jewish historians now tell us that something like 75%, they say, I have no reason to argue with them, they say that something like 75% of the funding for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, for SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they now tell us that something like 75% of the funding for those organizations in the 50s and early 60s was coming from Jewish sources. 75%. They're now telling us that Martin Luther King's most influential advisor was a Jewish man by the name of Stanley Levison. They're now telling us that Stanley Levison drafted Martin Luther King's speeches. I suspect he must have drafted his books as well, because if you look at Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, you find a very strange attack on what he calls black anti-Semitism. So it might very well be that Levison must have helped draft that book as well. We are now told that Levison was in charge of King's finances. We are now told that Levison was King's quote-unquote chief strategist. So here you had an incredible position of power and influence in the black civil rights movement. And much of what has happened in the last 20 years in Jewish-black relations can be explained around the question of that incredible power and influence which the major Jewish organizations had during the early phase of the black civil rights movement. Because what happened when the black power movement came into being in the middle of the 1960s was that the black power movement, without necessarily focusing on Jews per se, but the black power movement, just because it insisted on self-determination and self-reliance for black people, it began to look critically at the role of white people. And again, I'm not aware that the black power movement focused in on the white people as Jews, but they began to look at the role of alien people and the incredible influence which they had within our movement. And the Black Power movement, thanks to people like Carlos Cooks, people like Malcolm X, people like Stokely Carmichael, now Kwame Ture, H. Rap Brown, that whole generation, Assata Shakur, that whole generation, that Black Power generation began to say the time had come. As Marcus Garvey said in his famous essay on African fundamentalism, the time had come for us to take control over our own affairs. And so without necessarily targeting Jews as Jews, the Black Power movement, insofar as it expelled white people from the movement, automatically struck a very severe blow at that incredible Jewish power which had developed within the civil rights movement. And my suspicion is that once the Jewish establishment realized from the mid-60s on that they could no longer direct the black struggle from within, they seem to have taken a strategic decision that the next best thing was to try to destroy it from without. And so from the late 1960s on, you find a whole string of incidents bearing out my thesis. You had the Ocean Hill-Brownsville business back in 1968 in Brooklyn, where the Jewish teachers and the Jewish community generally destroyed the efforts of black parents to control the curriculum of their own schools, to control the education of their own children. You had the Baki case, among other cases. The Baki case is the most well-known of several court cases. In the Baki case, it was 1977, where you had a white man in California challenging the whole concept of quotas for black students in medical school. The case didn't involve Jews. The major Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, they inserted themselves into the case. The case didn't concern them. They voluntarily entered the case as so-called friends of the court to argue, to file briefs and to argue against the concept of affirmative action quotas for black people. Here you had major Jewish organizations representing Jewish people who today are the recipients of perhaps the largest reparations in history. The Jewish state of Israel has received billions of dollars in reparations from Germany over the last few decades, billions of dollars. And here were black people struggling to maintain the absolute minimal reparations, a few quotas in medical school. And here were the recipients of the world's greatest reparations in history, entering into this Baki case to destroy even that little modicum of reparations that black people were getting via a few little extra places in medical school. You had the Dubé case, which Milombe mentioned earlier, at Stony Brook, where the South African professor gave his class a series of essays. One of the essays was Zionism as racism, which at the time was a very topical question. It was being debated. In fact, the United Nations, I believe, actually passed a resolution to that effect. It was a very topical academic issue at that point. All the man did was to insert this among a whole list of possible essay topics. The result, he lost his job. You had the case of Andrew Young in 1979, the darling of the integrationist, traditionally pro-Jewish establishment. And even Andrew Young fell victim to Jewish wrath in this period. Andrew Young was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Here was a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations trying to mediate a problem between Jews and Palestinians. And he decided, as any rational person would do, that the only way to mediate a problem between two people is to talk to both of them. He had a meeting with the PLO. The result was that he lost his job. Around the same time that Andrew Young had his meeting with the PLO, a Jewish U.S. ambassador to Austria, a man named Wolf, also met with the PLO. Did he lose his job? No, of course not. He was a Jew, he could do what he wanted. Andrew Young was judged by a different standard. He wasn't supposed to do what the Jews didn't like, even though the Jews could do what the Jews didn't like. But Andrew Young, as a black man, couldn't do what the Jews didn't like. You had the ongoing situation of Crown Heights. I recall, and I'm sure everybody here in this room is much more familiar than I am with the case. I think it was in the 70s where the young young black man was killed by Jewish vigilantes in Crown Heights. Of course, we had the more recent situation in Crown Heights again over the last couple of years. Even Nelson Mandela was not exempt from Jewish wrath in this period. When Nelson Mandela came here to New York in 1990 on Ted Koppel's Nightline show, I distinctly recall Ted Koppel telling Nelson Mandela that he better go along with the Jewish agenda or risk losing support in America. And that in itself was a very revealing statement from Ted Koppel. Because what Koppel was saying in effect was that we Jews, he was saying, have the power in this country to deny you aid unless you go along with our agenda. That is what Koppel was in fact saying. It was what he precisely articulated, but if you read between the lines, that is what he was saying. And Mandela, all praises due to him, had the courage, the strength to tell Ted Koppel on international TV, Mr. Koppel, he said, your enemies are not my enemies. By some strange coincidence, Jesse Jackson was sitting in the front seat as this exchange was going on between Ted Koppel and Mr. Mandela. And I remember sitting by my TV and looking intently at the face of Jesse Jackson and wondering what was going through his mind and if perhaps he was learning something he didn't know before, something about dignity and self-respect. Of course, Jesse himself is another example of this incredible Jewish onslaught against black folk for the last 20 years. In both of his presidential campaigns, Jesse Jackson was harassed by the Jewish community. In fact, the Jews became perhaps his largest single opponents during both of his campaigns. So my own case comes in that kind of a historical context. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of that context. Here I am using a book, a well-documented scholarly book, The Secret Relation Between Blacks and Jews, in my African American survey class, and somebody decides that black folk aren't supposed to use this book. For several months before I used the book, the organized Jewish leadership had been very assiduously and systematically attacking the book in the press. And all of us know how the Jewish establishment operates. By attacking the book, first they attack the book, they call it anti-Semitic. Then they got a few Negro stooges to get up and attack the book too. And what they were doing was serving notice on all the other black professors out there, you all better not use this book, is what they were saying. Well, of course, I haven't been studying the Honorable Marcus Garvey for the last 20-odd years to let Jew or Gentile tell me which book is appropriate for my class. And so, naturally, I paid no heed to their warning. One of the Jewish newspapers, I believe it was the New York Forward newspaper, published by the Jewish community, after my situation arose, they had an article in there in which they said that I was defiant, quote unquote defiant. They called me defiant. And that too is very, very illustrative of what's really going on here. That proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that what they had done, their strategy was to tell black folk preemptively, as we say in Trinidad, from in front, not to use that book. So by my using the book, I was defiant. Who the hell are these Jews to tell me that I am defiant? They're not my mother, they're not my father. Defiant hell. The very term is so redolent of arrogance. Defiant. In other words, I am not supposed to use the book unless I get their permission, and having used the book in spite of the lack of permission, I was therefore being defiant. Can you imagine that? I was being defiant. My situation, I believe, is a very fascinating situation as a historian on the one hand, and also the person in the middle of it on the other hand. It gives me a very unique perspective on this whole situation, because as a historian I can stand back and look at the situation objectively, almost as though I'm not the one involved, as though somebody else over there. I can stand back and look at it through the perspective of a historian, and see it in context, historical context. Of course, as the person involved in it, I get a very intimate feel for the Jewish tactics in these kinds of areas. And so it seems to me that my situation has illuminated, for me at least, many of the basic principles upon which the Jewish onslaught has been practiced over the last couple of decades or more. First of all, there's their incredible arrogance. In my case, you had two students from the Hillel organization, which is the student arm of the ADL. Clearly, they had been primed by their superiors that this book was anti-Semitic, quote unquote. They came and sat in my class the first day of the semester, unknown to me. An incredibly arrogant thing. The students then did what their elders have always done. It's very interesting. When the Jewish establishment moves on you, they move straight to whoever they perceive to be your superiors. In this case, the Jewish students who had learned very well from the elders, they went straight to the president and the dean of the college. They never talked to me. They went straight to the president and the dean. The president sent them to the chairman of the department. The chairman sent them to me. That's when they came to me. Only when they couldn't deal at any other level did they come to me. The Jewish organization has waged a struggle against us over the last several decades, also because of its great influence in the media. And here again, my case illustrated this. You had 4 Jewish organizations getting together: the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Community Relations Council. 4 Jewish organizations got together and issued a joint press release against me, poor little me, saying I was anti-Semitic and bigoted, etc. I have a copy of the actual press release, and it's the most amazing press release I've ever seen, and I've seen many press releases in my time. This press release is on a piece of paper this big. It has the logos of all 4 organizations across the top. It has the signatures of the various executives of each organization. The piece of paper is so big that I liken it to a medieval scroll. I'm sure in the movies you've seen those medieval scrolls where King Arthur and the rest of them, so one of the knights at the round table would come to King Arthur and he would roll out this big long proclamation. Well, this is the proclamation they issued against me. They actually went on record as saying that it's the first time that 4 of the organizations ever got together to issue a single press release against a single individual. And the question, why is this overkill? And again, the reason has to be because they see a loss of power over black people. They vamped on Dr. Jeffries. As soon as they figured, well, Dr. Jeffries was, in the throes of struggle, somebody else cropped up at the side. They're getting to the point now where there are no more easy victories. In fact, where there are no victories at all. For the first time, they are at the point where we are beginning to win victories. And this makes them not only frantic and frenetic, but it almost makes them lose their mind. It pushes them into situations where they can't win. They have no mind. In both Dr. Jeffrey's situation and in my situation, they have gotten themselves into fights that they cannot win. They can't possibly win. And only a fool picks a fight that he can't win. And the only explanation for this is the great loss of power and that frantic desire to maintain what little power they have left, but they see it slipping away. History is moving against them, and they are beginning to act irrationally. And in that lack of rational action, of course, we have our opportunity. In my case, too, I saw the tendency, the ability, the historical ability of the Jewish leadership to resort to lies and distortions. The Boston Globe published 4 articles against me, including an editorial, in 6 days. And it was a great learning experience for my students, because here, luckily the class was still in session. So here we had students, I had a whole class full of students who had actually read this book, who knew what the issues were, And I was able to, bring these articles and show the students, And the students could see for themselves the lies and distortions. They were seeing things written in a paper, in an editorial. It was just totally devoid of any truth. One of the greatest distortions which has been manufactured around this particular case is that the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, alleges, they say, the Jews were genetically disposed towards slave owning. A couple nights ago, Ted Koppel, before Ted Koppel got into the Little Wellesley section, by the way, Koppel's people, not Koppel himself, interviewed me for something like 30 minutes in my office, but only about 2 seconds got onto that show. And they made sure they prefaced that 2 seconds by saying, Tony Martin is teaching this book that says the Jews are genetically disposed towards slavery. Then they gave me my little 2-minute clip. Of course, I had no means of responding in that type of situation. And that is a prime example of the resort to lies and distortions. Absolutely shameless. Another mode of operation of the Jewish leadership, which my case illustrates, is their shameless use of the Uncle Tom element within our race. Practically every single article that has been published on my situation in the Jewish press, and many of those in the non-ostensibly Jewish press, almost every single article has quoted Paul Skip Gates. If I was Skip Gates by this time, I would be just sick and tired of being quoted. Or as Skip Gates says, or the great Harvard University professor said, Skip Gates is not a historian, never wrote a history book in his life. He wrote, an op-ed in the New York Times about a book that showed no evidence that he had ever read the book. But the fact is that he has offered himself up to be used in this way. On my own campus, we have some of this element who are also falling over themselves in their rush to also offer themselves up in the hope, I presume, that they too will be rewarded as Skip Gates has been rewarded with fame and fortune. Another element of the tactics of the Jewish organizations, which my case illustrates, is their tendency to suppress free speech. They operate in the name of free speech, but they in fact suppress free speech. The question is free speech for the Jews and their Uncle Toms, stooges, and everybody else, if possible, is to be excluded from the media. We saw it on the Ted Koppel show, like I said, they biased the segment dealing with Wellesley, and of course I had no opportunity to respond. The Boston Globe, as I said, wrote an editorial attacking me. I wrote a letter responding. They refused to publish it. Even my very school newspaper refused to publish my response to all of the Jewish allegations. The school newspaper also refused to publish a black student's response to the allegations of the Jews. We also see in my case the tendency of the Jewish organizations to resort to dirty tricks. I discovered just 2 days ago that the Hillel organization on my campus has sent a packet of information to the parents of black students on my campus. A packet of information very prejudicial to me. Of course I will respond. I have the ability to respond, and I will respond. But it just goes to show the level of dirty tricks that these organizations will resort to. Perhaps the most important element of the Jewish tactics, which my case illustrates, is the tendency of these Jewish organizations, where they disagree with anyone, to go for the person's economic livelihood. Dubé lost his job at Stony Brook. Andrew Young lost his job at the United Nations. Many black principals and teachers lost their jobs when the Ocean Hill Brownsville thing went down. They removed Professor Jeffries from the chairmanship of the Black Studies Department at City College. In the press release which the 4 Jewish organizations put out against me, they called upon Wellesley College to fire me. Imagine that. They claimed, that they asked Wellesley College to quote-unquote review my tenure. In other words, they didn't like my perspective, so I'm supposed to be fired for using a book that tells the truth because they don't like the truth when it concerns them. Fortunately for us, like I said, the tide is turning. History is running against the Jewish leadership and their onslaught and their oppression, their manipulation of our movement for the last several decades. It is moving against them because we have an aroused population. We are in the midst of a black books revolution whereby our people, for the first time in our history, are now able to write books, publish them, distribute them, sell them, without going through any Jew or Gentile distributor. The power of the ability to publish their own material was very well demonstrated in my little broadside. Here was a broadside, just a little 4-page broadside. But I had the means, I had the ability, I had the experience, I had the know-how to publish several thousands of these broadsides and spread them around the country, get them directly into the hands of my people. And I was very heartened by the response of black people in this country. Everywhere the broadside went, people took it upon themselves to run off copies. A brother in Chicago told me he ran off several hundred copies. He went to a rally against Mayor Daley there and was just handing them out in the street. A brother in Montreal told me he ran off some hundreds of copies. Another brother in Chicago ran off hundreds of copies. A brother in Washington, D.C. told me he ran off hundreds of copies. And interestingly enough, when the 4 Jewish organizations got together and issued their press release against me, at that point they said in the press release that the book was no longer the problem. They said the broadside was the problem now. After having attacked me for 3 weeks for teaching the book, when the broadside came out, that blew their minds to such an extent that this great medieval scroll of a press release was put out, an unprecedented thing. 4 organizations, same press release. They called the broadside the most anti-Semitic thing they'd ever seen on a college campus. There was nothing anti-Semitic about the broadside. What they meant by anti-Semitic was that for the first time in a long time they saw a document which in a very articulate, succinct, direct and clear fashion exposed the role of the Jewish establishment in the black struggle for the last several decades. In other words, the truth. The truth was now presented in a way that could easily be assimilated by large numbers of people. The word was getting out. It did not go through Jewish distributors. There was no way they could prevent it getting out. And so, amazingly enough, I actually debated one of the leaders of the American Jewish Committee the other night on radio in Boston, and he was actually saying, oh, Tony Martin can teach whatever he wants, we don't, deny his right to teach the secret relationship, but the broadside. So if the broadside could cause this amount of trouble, just imagine the kind of problems they will have at the end of the summer when hopefully I will finish writing my book on the Jewish question. I'm going to call it the Jewish question, a black perspective. Dealing with the Jews for the last 2 months has made me an expert. An expert on the Jewish question. So I say in conclusion, I say like Brother Ilombe said, we're not going to back off this one. We're not going to back off from this point on. Let the Jeffries case be the first in a string of victories for African people in this country. As Professor Clark said, there must be no more easy victories for the Jews. There must be no victories at all for the Jews. This is the beginning of our victories. And so thank you very much again for this wonderful occasion. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Tony Martin, has taught at Wellesley College, Massachusetts since 1973. He was tenured in 1975 and has been a full professor in Africana Studies since 1979. Prior to that, he taught at the University of Michigan Flint and the Cipriani Labor College in Trinidad and St. Mary's College in Trinidad. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota, Brandeis University, Brown University, and the Colorado College. He has also spent a year as an honorary research fellow at the University of the West Indies, Trinidad. Professor Martin has written or compiled and edited 11 books. In 1965, he qualified as a barrister at law at the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn, London. He also holds a Bachelor of Science Honours degree in Economics at the University of Hull in England and a Master's and PhD degrees in History at the Michigan State University. His articles and reviews have appeared in the Journal of Negro History, American Historical Review, African Studies Review, Washington Post Book World, Journal of Caribbean History, I'll be done in a minute here, hang on. Journal of American History, Black Books Bulletin, Science and Society, the Jamaica Journal, to name a few, and he has contributed to several anthologies and encyclopedia. Professor Martin is currently working on a study of European Jewish immigration into Trinidad in the 1930s. For some years now, the IHR has sold his book, The Jewish Onslaught, Dispatches from the Wellesley Battlefront, which we have on sale in the back, which deals with his experience that came about in part from his using the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which we also have for sale there, as one of the sources for a course he was teaching. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tony Martin.
First of all, thank you very much, Greg, for the introduction. I'd like to thank also the IHR and Mark Weber particularly for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here to be part of this event. I like long-winded topics, or at least topic titles, so I'll read the topic which I have selected for today. It's as follows: Jewish tactics as exemplified in the controversy over Jewish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. That's Jewish tactics as exemplified in the controversy over Jewish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So I won't be speaking that much on the controversy itself. What I'm trying to do is to use my subjective experience, that is the experience I've had for close to a decade now in dealing with this controversy. And what I'm going to try to do for the next half hour or whatever is to use my concrete subjective experience on the firing line, so to speak, and I'm going to try to extract from my experience certain basic sort of tactics that I think that the Jewish lobby has used over the years pertaining to my particular situation. But in trying to extract these sort of principles or tactics from my subjective situation, I suspect that I may very well resonate with the experience of some other people here, because my suspicion is that there tends to be a generalized practice which transcends, particular situations. So that even though in my case I was dealing with a specific situation, the transatlantic slave trade, my suspicion is that the kinds of tactics which were used against me may be not very dissimilar to many other folks who have been involved in other kinds of disputes with this particular lobby. The first thing I should do by way of introduction is just to basically summarize precisely what my controversy was. I know it's familiar to many people here, but I'm sure not to everybody in this audience. As was mentioned a minute ago in the introduction by Greg Raven, I teach at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. For many years I've taught a survey course in African American history. And in 1993, I introduced into my course, this is a one-semester course, it moves very rapidly over the whole gamut of African American history. And I introduced in 1993 a book which is on sale at the back, a book which then was fairly new, a book which I myself had only just recently become introduced to. That is a book published by the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam. The book is entitled The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. And what that book did, relying primarily on sources written by Jews, Jewish sources of a variety of different types, that book
tried to sort of synthesize the existing information on Jewish involvement in the slave trade, the bringing of Africans as slaves from Africa to the so-called New World. There wasn't that much in the book that was new, in the sense that all the information practically was secondary information which had been already published, although hidden away to a large extent in very esoteric Jewish journals, which the average Jew, I discovered later, had no idea about. Nevertheless, it wasn't new information. It was new to many people, including myself. And I found it very interesting that I had taught African American history for many years, but had only been dimly aware of the role of Jews in that slave trade. What I discovered was that the Jewish role in that slave trade had been very cleverly camouflaged for many, many years. Where Jews were involved, usually they tended not to be identified as Jews, whereas, where Christians were involved, where Muslims were involved, there was ready identification, of such persons by their ethnicity, by their religious affiliation, and so on. In the case of Jews, they would be called other things: Portuguese, Spanish, Brazilian, whatever. But that crucial identification tended to be obscured. So, as a good professor, I think I'm a good professor, and I'm always on the lookout for new information to enrich my classes. So I was very fascinated by this new information and decided to add a few readings from this book in my class. And that's when, as the saying goes, all hell broke loose. Apparently, I didn't realize it, but I actually stumbled into a controversy which was already brewing, because the book had apparently caused some consternation in Jewish circles. And it's only afterwards, when I went back and did my research, I discovered that one or two editorials had already appeared, by way of the Jewish power structure, in a sense warning people like myself to stay away from the book. There already apparently had been a full-page op-ed in the New York Times. I was told the longest op-ed that had ever been published in the New York Times. It was actually typeset in the form of a Star of David. It was written by someone called Henry Louis Gates, one of the black spokesmen for the Jewish lobby, somebody at Harvard University right now. Even the paper from my basic hometown, the Boston Globe, had carried an editorial, which I was unaware of at the time. But they had carried an editorial not long before I began to use the book. And in a sense, the purpose of these editorials and op-eds was to warn folks to stay away from that book or else. But me, in my foolhardiness, ignored the warnings, being largely unaware of the warnings in the first place. And so I stumbled into this problem. Now, it so happens, again, I wasn't totally aware of all this, but by way of background, I know a little bit now, more than I did then. But now I realize that Jews had in fact been involved not only in the African slave trade, but they had been involved in a variety of other slave trades too for a very long period of time. Apparently, they had actually dominated slavery and the slave trade in medieval times. On the plane on the way here a couple of days ago, I was rereading a dissertation, a PhD dissertation from 1977 by a man called Harold D. Brackman, who is a functionary of the Simon Wiesenthal Center of all places. And he did a PhD dissertation detailing black-Jewish relations from ancient times up to 1900. And he actually mentions in his dissertation, he acknowledges the fact that Jews were the principal slave traders in the world for several hundred years, although in typical fashion he puts a very interesting spin on it. He acknowledges, as I guess he has to, the Jews were the major slave traders in the world, trading slaves everywhere from Russia to Western Europe, to India, to China. But he says that they dominated the world trade only for a few hundred years, only. He says they were the main slave traders from the 8th century to the 12th century, but that was no big thing. It was only a few hundred years. I discovered also that the Jews were very instrumental in the ideological underpinning for the African slave trade, the notorious Hamitic myth, which more than any other single event provided the sort of ideological underpinning, the rationale for the slave trade. That this comes out of the Talmud, and this was, and in fact Harold Brackman himself acknowledges that this was the first
explication of the so-called story in Genesis about Ham, being about Ham, the progenitor, so-called, of the African race, being cursed by Noah and so on. But apparently, according to Blackburn, the Talmud was the first place that put a racist spin on this story. The biblical story was racially neutral, but the Talmud apparently put a very awful racist spin on this story, which later on became the basis, the ideological underpinning for the African slave trade. So all of this I was to discover as I became embroiled in this controversy. One of the things that interested me too was that the Jewish element was apparently also a major element in what came to be known in the 19th century as the white slave trade. The white slave trade apparently was a major multinational, international trading in women and for sexual, for immoral sexual purposes. The trafficking of women internationally as prostitutes and so on. And apparently the Jewish entrepreneurs in Europe apparently were also major figures in that so-called slave trade. And apparently many of the women that trafficked were some of their own women as well. So all of this, I became aware of. As far as the African slave trade was concerned, just to summarize briefly what I discovered in the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, and in subsequent readings, I discovered that once the African slave trade got going in the 15th century, that again, Jews were a very important part of it. And again, the book was not suggesting, neither have I ever suggested that the Jews were the only people involved, or even the major people involved. But my basic, point has always been that everybody else that I'm aware of who has been, who was a part of the slave trade has acknowledged being part of the slave trade. Many of the people who were part of the genesis of the slave trade also became part of the abolitionist movement to end the slave trade. But as far as I know, the Jewish element is the only element that has, resisted acknowledging the participation in this trade, and in fact have gone beyond merely resisting knowledge of this information coming out, but have become very upset when this information has come to the fore. And that has been my basic problem. Why? What's so special about this group that places them beyond the pale, so to speak, no pun intended, beyond the pale of criticism? Any other group can be criticized, but it seems to me that this group is beyond criticism. And especially for me as a black person, I become very upset if someone tries to walk into my classroom to tell me that I, as a black person teaching black history, that I have to sort of regard their involvement in my history as somehow out of bounds. So they then were involved in the history via the Hamitic myth. They were some of the important financiers of this slave trade in the very early periods. One of the major multinational corporations that financed the Atlantic slave trade very early was the Dutch West India Company. And of course, as we know, the Jews had been chased out of Spain, chased out of Portugal, and the Netherlands was the one area, Holland, which welcomed them to some degree. And this was right around the same time, the 15th century, that the slave trade was gearing up. So they were geographically positioned and positioned in other ways to become an important element in the financing of the Dutch West India Company, which was a major multinational corporation, involved in the slave trade. In the early days, the 17th century, they were among, in fact, they were a major element in the slave trade in places like Brazil, places like Suriname in South America, places like Curacao in the West Indies, places like Jamaica, Barbados, and other places as well. I discovered that they were also very well positioned in this country, that many of the slave traders, many of the people who brought slaves across the Atlantic from this country in colonial times were in fact Jewish ship owners and slave traders. Some of the best known names in that traffic coming out of colonial North America were people like Aaron Lopez, one of the best known names of all, from Newport, Rhode Island, and others. I discovered the Jews owned many of the ancillary corporations that sort of fed into the slave trade. For example, rum distilling was one of the major areas that was ancillary to the slave trade, because rum was used as a trading, an item of trade, to exchange for slaves in West Africa. And I believe that most or all of the rum distilleries in places like Boston and elsewhere in New England were owned by Jews and so on. I discovered that according to the 1830 census,
that even though Jews were a small proportion of the population in North America, nevertheless, they were inordinately represented among the slave owners. Yes, they were a small portion of the population overall, but on a percentage basis, apparently Jewish historians themselves have analyzed the 1830 census and have discovered that whereas for the white population as a whole, something like maybe 30-odd% of the white population may have owned one or more slaves in the South, for Jewish households it was over 70%. So on a percentage basis, Jews were more than twice as likely to own slaves according to the 1830 census, according to an analysis of the 1830 census of the US done by Jewish historians themselves. I also discovered that Jews, despite their involvement in the slave trade, were very few and far between in the abolitionist movement. They were much less likely than other groups to be involved in the abolitionist movement. So that, in a nutshell, then, is the set of facts that caused me to become involved in this interesting controversy. And what I want to do then is to dwell not on the facts themselves, but on what I perceive to be the main tactics that were used, because I found myself, like I said, on the front line of this situation, and I became very fascinated looking at the tactics. And the more I began to read around this question, the more I discovered that I saw parallels, emerging in other kinds of situations as well. The first and major tactic that I discovered in their attack on me was the reliance on lies. That's straight up lies. There's no other way to describe it. Just telling lies. Many of the categories that I will enumerate overlap, and many of them could also come under this general rubric of telling lies. But I think that if one had to isolate a single tactic, it was a tactic of telling lies. I think they have elevated telling lies to a very high artistic form. For example, very early in my controversy, the major Jewish organizations became involved. And this is very fascinating. Here am I, a professor in a very small college, teaching a class of about maybe 30 students, but they attach such great importance to this that within a very short space of time, the major Jewish organizations became involved, and it became a national event. For example, you found that on a Sunday morning the week with David Brinkley on ABC TV, would have a whole segment dealing with this question, with telling my students that the Jews were involved in the slave trade. Up to now, I'm still a little astounded, considering the prominence that what to me was a totally inconsequential thing was given. Now, shortly after all of this started, 4 of the major Jewish organizations issued a joint press release attacking me. The ADL, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, and the Jewish Community Relations Council of Boston or Greater Boston or something like that. They themselves said afterwards that this was somewhat unprecedented, that 4 of these major Jewish organizations should have combined their efforts to attack one little obscure professor in a small school. They themselves admitted that this was somewhat unprecedented. They also admitted that apparently this press release was issued in the middle of one of their high holidays, of which there are quite a few, I understand, and it was somewhat unusual for them to sort of disturb the sanctity of this high holiday by issuing something along these lines. Now, I actually saw one of the original press releases, and I have likened it to a medieval scroll. It reminded me of the movies I saw as a boy with Robin Hood, where the sheriff of Nottingham would go into Sherwood Forest, and he would unroll a long proclamation, and he would tuck it on a tree, saying, "Robin Hood, beware, you're looking for you," that kind of a thing. This was literally a scroll, literally. You couldn't read it without having to unroll it. It was literally. I've never seen anything like it. And it was signed with, it had the logos of all of these 4 organizations. And this opened my eyes to the proclivity of these folks to tell lies. Now, this proclamation told the world that I was refusing to let my students discuss this information. First of all, it presented me as providing wrong information, blatantly false information, as another Jewish person described it to my classroom. And it said that I was refusing, here was I in a classroom apparently ramming this stuff down my students' throats and forbidding any discussion, which was absolutely, hideously untrue. It said that I had a history of all kinds of problems with my school, and that my colleagues had been complaining about me for many years. Up to now, I have no inkling of what these complaints could possibly be. I know of no such incidents, certainly not before this time. I was able to take, this press release to my class and read it to the very class, and it was a very good learning experience for the students, because here were the students who I was accused of misleading and whatnot, and I was able to show them themselves the kind of information that makes it into the major media. One of the interesting lies that came out around this time was the rabbi, the campus rabbi. She came to my office. It's a she, actually. She came to my office, complaining about my teaching this information. So I told her, well, look, if you think this information is false, why don't you come to my class? I will invite you to my classroom, and you can come to my class. I'm going to allow you to stand up in front of my class and explain to them what's wrong about this information, and then we can have a debate in front of the class. And she agreed. But of course, she quickly changed her mind. And not only did she change her mind, but then she put it out that I had refused to discuss the material with her. So point number one is their proclivity to tell lies. Point number two was a very interesting proclivity towards attempting to damage one's professional credibility. There was a tendency to libel and slander whoever they were, upset with. In this case, it was me. There was one Jewish gentleman about 50 years old who began making anonymous calls, random calls to the campus. He would call the dorms, he would call people's offices just randomly, and he would tell them he was a Jewish student at Harvard University. He would tell them that he had discovered that I did not really have a PhD and that I was not qualified to be teaching at Wellesley College. This was one of the more bizarre examples of the attempt to discredit me, professionally. There was a gentleman who I subsequently brought a libel case against, and I lost. I brought about 3 cases, lost them all. But this gentleman suggested that I was an affirmative action PhD. The only reason I got a PhD was because of affirmative action. He said the only reason why I got tenure at Wellesley College, I was one of the youngest professors ever tenured at Wellesley College. But he said the reason why I got tenure at Wellesley College was because they were afraid of me. I was this great, black, loudmouth person. So just to keep me quiet, they decided to give me tenure. One of the most interesting of these efforts to discredit me was by a gentleman called Leon Wieseltier, or maybe Wieseltier, I don't know. He describes himself as a literary editor of the New Republic magazine. Now, the Washington Post book world in 1994, I think it was, at the height of this, and up to now I'm kind of surprised at this, but at the height of all the hysteria around this question, the Washington Post book world invited me to review 4 new books, for the issue on Sunday, which I did. They gave me a lot of space. It was the longest book review in that issue. And predictably, in the very next week's issue, there were 2 or 3 outraged letters from Jewish individuals asking the Washington Post book world, if they weren't aware who this person was that they had allowed to grace their pages. This was the great anti-Semite Tony Martin. Don't you know who this is? How can you let him write in this kind of a prestigious journal? And this guy, Wieseltier, went a step further. The title of my book is The Jewish Onslaught, and the subtitle is Dispatches from the Wellesley Battlefront. Now, I spell dispatches D-E-S. Most Americans spell it D-I-S. I grew up in a British tradition, in a British colony, and up to this day I spell honor H-O-N-O-U-R. Most of you do not. So the E is the British spelling. And this idiot obviously didn't realize that there were alternative spellings of the word dispatches. And again, so anxious are they to try to discredit people who they disagree with. This guy actually, told the Washington Post book world in his letter that I was so ignorant and stupid I couldn't even spell the word dispatches. And look how stupid I was. And this was the stupid kind of a person that they were allowing to publish in their journal. Luckily for me, the editor of the Washington Post book world was one of those rare persons who was apparently not too cowed
by the Jewish onslaught. And she wrote a very nice letter back, a rejoinder, telling Wieseltier that she had checked 2 dictionaries, and in both of them she saw dispatches spelled with an E, you know, as one of the optional spellings of the word. Then there was Mary Lefkowitz, the great Mary Lefkowitz, one of my colleagues at Wellesley College, who wrote in a little literary magazine that I'd never seen before. But she wrote in this magazine, she actually alleged that I had physically assaulted a white student. Now, I teach in a women's college. So, you know, so here she playing into, I guess, you know, all these perceptions of this big black rapist or whatever. But she actually alleged that I actually physically pushed down a white student. This would be a young white woman, and the woman fell down. Then she said I bent over her and raged. That was the word she used. I raged. I bent over her and raged. You know, one had this vision of this raging animal, you know. So of course I brought a libel suit against her. And one of the things I discovered was that you know, these folks are very, very well positioned in the court system. So in fact, after having lost, I guess, 2 libel suits, I'm beginning to think that they must have had something to do with fashioning the libel laws in this country, because in this case, you know, Lefkowitz actually acknowledged that what she said was wrong, you know, and she acknowledged that she had not taken due care in ascertaining the facts. And even those acknowledgments were not enough for me to win the case. You know, I had to prove that she had acted with reckless abandon and all kinds of things. But it was a very interesting learning experience for me, you know, how the libel laws, because especially once they identify you as what they call a public person. The way the libel laws in this country are organized, once you are identified as a public person, people basically have carte blanche. They can say anything about you. It can be true, it can be false. They don't have to do their research. They can say anything they want, almost. I mean, it's almost that bad. So these are some of the efforts to discredit me. Of course, I don't think that they succeeded, but again, this was the you know, very persistent effort to sort of tarnish your image. And very much aligned to this, of course, was the generalized question of character assassination. This was part of that effort to damage one's credibility. There was also the tactic of what I describe as dirty tricks. Of course, this too is a subset within the general rubric of lies, I suppose. For example, there's a group at Wellesley College called the Friends of Wellesley Hillel. Hillel is a Jewish student organization which exists around the country on I guess, most campuses. I remember reading in Paul Finley's book, They Dare to Speak Out, he says in there that the Hillel groups are actually trained. They are formally trained, apparently, by the ADL and other organizations in tactics, you know, how to disrupt meetings, how to, you know, push false propaganda on campuses and so on. And so I don't know for a fact, but certainly those Hillel students who were part of the campaign against me did appear to have been people who were professionally trained. In fact, the whole campaign against me was initiated by students from the Hillel group. They sat in on my class on the first day of the semester, just for one day. And somehow from that one day's class, where I didn't really even talk about the subject, they somehow figured out that I was teaching this book as fact. Apparently they figured that if I was teaching the book as hate literature, quote unquote, that would be okay. But the fact that I was teaching the book as just any other book, you know, having, you know, basic academic credibility, that of course they considered to be a grossly anti-Semitic thing. And they were the ones who raised the hue and cry. But there's a group on campus called the Friends of Wellesley Hillel. This is a group of faculty and alumni who work very closely with the Hillel students. And in the midst of this campaign, they actually put together a packet of mostly libelous information and mailed it to the mother of one of the students who was very, very vocal, you know, on my behalf. The students rallied around me, and these folks, you know, it's quite incredible the limits that these, you know, the extent towards, you know, to which these folks would operate. They, you know, this is a group of grown people. In fact, people like deans of the college, professors, people like that, took the time to sit on, put together a packet of basically lies and misinformation, to send it. You know, they actually targeted this one student because she was a leader of the, you know, of the group of students who were supporting me, and sent this information to her mother.
Somebody came and tacked up a flyer around my office one day. I wasn't in the office, alleging sexual misconduct between myself and the same student because she was so, vocal on my behalf. Of course, it didn't work, fortunately for me. They started a rumor at one point that if I wrote recommendations for any students, the students would not get jobs and would not get, entry into graduate school or anything. But these were some of the kinds of what I call dirty tricks. There was also the tactic of what I call going for the economic jugular. From very early, they evinced a very concentrated effort to try to remove my ability to survive economically. One of the things, for example, that joint press release called for, it called for my expulsion from the college. It called for my tenure to be revoked. So again, it seems to me that that's one of the hallmarks of the tactics here, and I'm sure that this is a wider application than just my subjective case. There was also the tactic of what I call great presumptuousness. I heard somebody last night mention the word chutzpah. I call it presumptuousness. The idea that a rabbi, the student chaplain could come into my office to demand, why am I teaching this information? That to me is sheer presumptuousness. My response basically, even though I was polite, but the intent of my response as well, who the hell are you, to come into here to tell me what I must teach, in a Black Studies class? I'm an expert in Black Studies. Who the hell are you, I didn't say it in those terms, but that was the import of what I was saying. I remember, and I mentioned this, I believe, in the introduction to my book, but before this Jewish onslaught began with me, just by sheer coincidence, a few months earlier, I was doing some research in a Jewish archive in New York City, and at that time, a case similar to mine had just erupted concerning Professor Len Jeffries at City College in New York City. He had made a speech in Albany, New York, in which he had pointed out that the Jews had a very large hand in fashioning Hollywood. In fact, there's a book by a Jewish author called, that's right, An Empire of Our Own. And the subtitle, interestingly enough, is How the Jews Invented Hollywood. This is a Jewish writer. His name is Neil Gabler. An Empire of Our Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. What could be more explicit than that? He is boasting in the book, the way the Jews basically shaped American popular culture. So Len Jeffries, in his speech in Albany, said, well, okay, so you all invented American popular culture. You have to take, a large portion of the blame for the negative stereotypes, concerning black folk that have been nurtured by Hollywood over the years. But of course, they want to have their cake and eat it. They want to invent Hollywood, but they don't want to take responsibility for the negative, elements coming out of Hollywood. So he was branded as anti-Semitic as usual for having said that. So when I went to this Jewish archive, my own case had not yet, emerged, but they tried to put me through this litmus test. It was almost as though they would not let me use the archives unless I, disavowed any kind of knowledge and so on. And the woman in charge, she asked me, do you know Len Jeffries? I said, yes, I know him. He's a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine, and she was very upset. But again, there's this presumptuousness, this feeling that they have a right to put you through all these litmus tests, a right to demand of you why you are doing something which is totally correct and totally inoffensive and would be inoffensive to anybody else. Another tactic which I think I can distill out of my experience is a tendency to sidestep the real issues. I discovered that throughout this whole, almost 10 years now, they will almost never engage me on the facts of the matter. They will say, okay, Jews weren't involved in the slave trade, you're a big anti-Semitic, so I'll say, well, okay, well, let's discuss it. Were Jews indeed half of the slave owners in Brazil in the 17th century? I'll say, look at your own Encyclopedia Judaica. It says the Jews were half the slave owners in Brazil. But they will never engage that kind of factual debate. Never. They'll always go off on a tangent, try to besmirch your character, try to take away your economic, wherewithal and so on. but they will almost never, they studiously avoid ever engaging, the actual facts of the matter. I had a graphic illustration of this just a few weeks ago when this question flared very briefly again on my campus. Somebody mentioned that I had 10 years ago taught these blatant falsehoods and whatnot, so I responded in the newspaper. And a couple of Jewish students wrote back, responding to me. And again, and in my response, I laid out, several examples of Jewish historians acknowledging their involvement in the slave trade. There was no reference to this at all. Instead, they began talking about stories of coming out of Europe in the Middle Ages or sometime, about Jews killing white kids to take their blood and put it in matzos, and stories about their Jewish Holocaust, all kind of stuff, but had nothing to do with anything. And in fact, I responded asking them, well, what does all of this have to do with the point that I'm making? Did you not read my article? Did you not see the evidence I gave you concerning Jewish involvement in the slave trade? What does somebody, killing somebody for their blood to put in the matzo have to do with the slave trade? But this is always their tendency. They will studiously avoid the facts, avoid the issue at hand, but bring in all kinds of, off what we call, in popular parlance, red herrings, off-the-wall stuff, red herrings. And this is a very persistent tactic that I was able to discern. Another tactic, and this is similar, I guess, maybe saying the same thing in different ways, but that is the tendency to introduce, men of straw men. For example, I'm discussing Jewish involvement in the slave trade, but somebody is going to write an article saying that I alleged, which is not true, that Jews were genetically predispositioned towards enslaving others. Now, this has nothing to do with anything that I was talking about, but they will totally disregard the facts of the case and introduce something totally different. And what they tend to do is they will introduce a man of straw, put the straw thing on the record, and then they will proceed to attack the man of straw that they have created. Yes. And because they have such great influence in the media, this man, this straw man, this false information, all of a sudden becomes part of the record. Even in the courthouse, they'll go into court and reference the same lies that they put in the newspaper as though this is some disinterested source, some third party. And then this brings me to the next point I was going to make, and that was precisely that, their ability to plant misinformation on the record and then use that information as though it is some kind of a well-documented primary source. Point number 10, what I call the use of quislings, surrogates, and what in the black community we call Uncle Toms. They have developed this art to a very high level, at least in my case, around the black community. I mentioned Skip Gates at Harvard University. There are many other notorious figures like that in the black community who were all too willing to do their bidding. I must say that these folks were very, very well recompensed. These folks have been given incredible prominence. These folks now go around the world speaking on, for $15,000 at a time. These are the kind of honorariums these folks get now. They've all been given endowed chairs in their universities. Many of them are very, very weak scholars. Can hardly put two sentences together. But because they've been willing to play this game, they have been elevated to prominence. Every time you pick up the New York Times, you'll see them on the cover of the Sunday magazine. Any issue that comes up pertaining to black folk, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be history of Africa. It could be contemporary politics in the Caribbean. It doesn't matter what it is. They are quoted as the authorities and so on. You see them on PBS hosting, all kinds of multi-million-dollar programs and documentaries and so on. But this element, I think, has been a very effective tactic on their part to identify people from within, in this case, my own group, but people who were willing to, in a sense, sell themselves for the, admittedly very ample rewards that they were given as a result. Another tactic is their ability to leverage off of the influence which they undoubtedly have in high places. At Wellesley College, for example, we had a new president coming into Wellesley College just as my thing was moving to its climax, so to speak. And this new president came into the college not knowing anything about what was happening before.
And somehow these folks got her to write a letter, which I suspect they must have drafted themselves, because she had no real knowledge of the background of what was happening. But this letter, it is said, based on newspaper reports, was sent out to maybe 40 to 60,000 people. This was a letter condemning me for teaching that Jews were involved in the slave trade. So you had the incoming president of Wellesley College sending out 40 to 60,000 letters. This must be unprecedented in the annals of American higher education. I think this is something for the Guinness Book of World Records, where a president of a university sends out possibly 60,000 letters condemning one of our own professors for teaching something that is historically true. I've never ever heard of such a case. In fact, maybe I will indeed write to the Guinness Book of Records and see if they can immortalize me by putting this in there. Then there was the American Historical Association. 3 of these Jewish historians actually went to the American Historical Association and got the American Historical Association to decree, that's the only term I can use, to decree by executive fiat that Jews were not involved in the slave trade. I've never ever heard of any such thing. This is totally antithetical to the way that academia operates. Who has ever heard of such a thing? Historical fact being determined by presidential decree from the American Historical Association. We decree. It's like the papal bulls in the Middle Ages. It's a papal bull. We decree that Jews were not involved in the slave trade. It is absolutely amazing. But they actually succeeded in having this done. Then there's one of the most amazing cases of all, where I was invited to speak in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, by Worcester State College, around about 1994 or 95. And the Jewish groups were actually able to get the mayor of Worcester. Worcester is one of the largest cities in Massachusetts. They were able to get the mayor of Worcester to call together a special press conference in which he had the leaders of all the major religions in the place. He had the Roman Catholic head, he had a Baptist head, heads of various Protestant denominations, various, rabbis, ADL types, and so on. This man assembled an entire coalition of religious and apparently civil rights organizations for what? To denounce me prior to my appearance at Worcester State College. They had tried to put pressure on the college and the people who invited me. To their great credit, they were strong. They said, and they refused to bow, and they invited me and I spoke. But here were these groups powerful enough to get the mayor of a major city. You would think that the mayor had, important things to do. The mayor to put together a special conclave and a huge press release to denounce me about a day or two. And of course the result was that my speech, when it did indeed take place, drew the largest audience in the history of the school. Actually, I didn't include this in my talk, but I really should have included, as one of the tactics, their tendency on occasion to shoot themselves in the foot. Because this whole incredible story of the Jewish involvement in the slave trade, if they'd left me alone, I think the only people who would have known of their involvement would have been my 30 students and myself. But of course now the whole world knows about it, and the question of African slavery will never ever again be raised without the question of the Jewish input being part of the discussion, whether they deny it or not. But it is now in the forefront of people's consciousness. And this is due to them. I could never have promoted this idea the way that they did. Another tactic, I'm going to end up in a couple of minutes, but another tactic is of course, the use of the major media. They become very agitated when one speaks of their control of the media. That's one of the most anti-Semitic things that it is possible for anybody to say. And yet, as in the case of the Jewish involvement in Hollywood, they themselves, they boast about their prominence in the media. In fact, in my book, In the Jewish Onslaught, I quote Charles Silberman, a Jewish author. He wrote a book back in the 80s, I think, called A Certain People. And he boasts in that book about the fact that he said at that time there were 7 major top editors of the New York Times. He said all 7 were Jews. He talked about the major TV networks, and where I forget the precise figure, but the majority of the senior producers in the TV stations were all Jews, he said. And the producers are the people who really dictate, You know, what gets on the news, what stays out, what spin is put on information and so on. So the people who were crucial to spinning the news, he was saying were primarily Jews. He named names. And I quoted him in my book, but you know, but I became anti-Semitic for quoting him, which was not unusual. When that huge scroll, that press release scroll, you know, was issued by the 4 major Jewish organizations, the Boston Globe, the major newspaper in Boston, the Boston Globe published 4 major articles, including editorials and op-eds, within about 6 days, attacking me on that question, including an op-ed in the Sunday paper, including an editorial. This is a major editorial on the editorial page, a major editorial, again, fraught with lies and distortions. I sent in a letter responding to them. They refused to publish my letter. So they had 4 letters, not letters, 4 editorials, you could say, attacking me in less than a week, and refused to publish my rejoinder. And so that's a great sort of a tactic, because these folks have such a sway over the major media. It gives them a very great advantage. I remember being interviewed for the Fox front page program. They interviewed me for over an hour. But I guess that my responses to the questions were so tight that they could not find, any soundbite to extract and make me look bad. And so what they did is they gave me a couple of soundbites, maybe half a second each. But instead of letting me talk, they had some kind of a narrator who spent about 5 minutes telling folks what I had said, but not letting me say anything practically. And that too is one of the tactics. The use of organizations is another tactic. Of course, I don't have to tell this audience about the ADL. I heard Brad Smith talking about the ADL's mention of him on their website. I think I also have pride of place on the website. For several years, I haven't checked recently, but for several years, I used to have honorable mention every year in the list of anti-Semitic occurrences and so on. They would list the anti-Semitic occurrences of the previous year, and there would be something like Tony Martin gave a lecture at XYZ College, and that in itself would be an anti-Semitic event. The fact that I gave a lecture someplace. The ADL actually wrote a book about me, which I haven't read yet. I've had it for years. I haven't got around to reading it. It's called something like I think they took my title and turned it around. Something like the Jewish onslaught of Tony Martin, or Tony Martin's onslaught against the Jews, something like that. It's a whole big book, one of their so-called reports, an ADL report. Another tactic is what I call the unseemly histrionics. When I spoke at Worcester State College, there was a Jewish lady, I think her name was Schneider or something, but there was a Jewish lady who was on the board of trustees of Worcester State College. And she resigned from the board of trustees amidst great fanfare because of the school's invitation to me. And that's what I call nothing but stupid histrionics. But it got a lot of press, of course. It created a lot of interest in the media. But again, it was a case of shooting herself in the foot, because I remember they had me initially scheduled for an auditorium that held about 100 people. But when the hysteria, generated by themselves developed, they had to change it to the venue, to the largest auditorium they had, which held about 300 people. And that wasn't big enough. So eventually, when I turned up on a cold, wintry morning in February, they had that 300 capacity auditorium full, totally full. Then they had to run closed circuit televisions outside for another 300 people to hear what I had to say. And of course, my speech got to be front page news in the Worcester Telegram and Gazette next morning and so on. But all of that aided by these ignorant histrionics. One of the things they do too is to try to pin what I call a nickname on you. They try to find some little slip of tongue or some little thing they can take out of context. And if they find it, then every time your name is mentioned in the media, they stick that on you. For example, Minister Louis Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam, he made a slip one once. He was talking about the fact that I mentioned earlier, the fact that 75% of Jewish households, in 1830, owned slaves. But he kind of got it wrong, as one often does in the midst of a speech, a little slip of the tongue. And when he said it, it came out as Jews own 75% of the slaves. It was obviously a slip of the tongue. But every time they mentioned him since, they always put that soundbite in, make it look like he was this great distorter of the truth. Here was Minister Farrakhan saying that, you know, Jews own 75% of the slaves and so on. In my case, fortunately for me, the most they could find on me was controversial. So every time they mention me, I get to be the controversial professor. They're also very good at the good cop, bad cop kind of a thing. You know, while some are trying to destroy you on one side, another one will come on the other side, and, you know, smiling and whatnot. But beware of the good cop. Very often it's better to deal with the bad cop, because the good one will get you in jail very often much more quickly and smoothly than the bad one will. Sometimes too, they try to play you for a fool, you know, and they'll be trying to destroy you, and at the same time they're trying to destroy you, they're trying to give you advice. For example, last year when I decided to, you know, to accept David Irving's invitation to speak in Cincinnati, you know, there was a guy whose name I don't recall, but he sent me an email, you know, telling me what a racist David Irving was. He sent me this copy of some poem that David Irving had written, saying he didn't want his daughter to marry a Rastafarian or something, you know, which is neither here nor there as far as I'm concerned. You know, that's you know, doesn't mean anything to me. It's neither here nor there. If he wants his daughter to marry a Rastafarian or anybody else, or not marry them, so what? You know, that has nothing to do with anything as far as I'm concerned. But again, you know, here are people who are trying to destroy me, people who have spent the last 10 years trying to portray me as all kinds of things, trying to take my livelihood away. You know, and these same people, you know, can have the, you know, the I guess chutzpah, I guess, the try now to tell me, to warn me against somebody else. You know, the whole idea of it is just totally amazing to me. Of course, I didn't, you know, pay any great attention to what these guys were trying to say. One of the tactics too was hate mail. I discovered that their propensity for hate mail was absolutely amazing. Up to now, I still get a lot of hate emails. I get, just about a few days ago, I got a hate postcard. You know, and on the one hand, they try to portray themselves as, you know, as these great liberal types, but there's this sort of a underbelly, you know, at the same time. So while in the public, you know, in the public light, they're trying to portray themselves as liberals and nice folks and whatnot. At the very same time, simultaneously, it's like a two-pronged attack, you know. But at the very same time, you're getting this other kind of stuff, which also reminds me of the tendency towards violence. There was one Jewish guy, he said he was a Russian Jew, he said he was, a man called Alexander Nechaevsky, who actually came onto my campus, said he came to get me. Luckily, I wasn't there to be gotten that day, I was somewhere out of town, but he came to the office saying he had come to get me and whatnot. They had to call the campus police for him, and he was given an order not to, a trespass order, I think they called it, not to appear on the campus again. So these then are some of the kinds of tactics, and there are others, but I know my time is up. But these are some of the kinds of tactics that I have been able to distill from my subjective interaction with these folks over the last maybe 9 or 10 years. And again, I've been very fascinated by the fact that as I've become, you know, more broadly aware of you know, of similar situations involving different kinds of circumstances, that it seems to me that many of these kinds of tactics may in fact be tactics of much more generalized application. And I will end by saying simply that I don't know what's necessarily the best way to respond, but I can just maybe outline very quickly the ways that I have tried to respond. I have tried to respond, first of all, by trying to stand on principle. From the very beginning, I've said that, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I'm talking the truth. The Jews were indeed involved in the slave trade. I'm not aware of what your problem is. And as long as I am convinced in my own mind that I'm talking the truth, then that's it. You know, I've tried to disregard all of the other foolishness, and I've tried to stand on the truth. For example, I've been on TV many times debating people from American Jewish Committee and so on. And again, in that face-to-face debate, all of these tactics come into play. They try to attack your credibility, your character. But what I've always tried to do in those exchanges is to ignore, as far as I can, all of the ad hominem attacks and so on, and concentrate on the facts. So they'll say Tony Martin's an anti-Semite, I'll just ignore it. I'll say 75% of Jewish households own slaves, according to the 1830 census. I'll stick to the facts, and I use those kinds of media appearances as an opportunity to inform whoever happens to be listening. I've also tried where I could, to myself, leverage off of their media power. There have been times when they have unwittingly given me an opportunity, you know, to appear before the mass media, and I've used those opportunities to the hilt. Again, to push facts. I know I only have 30 seconds, and I try to ram as many facts and into those 30 seconds as I can, and let's forget all the anti-Semitic stuff, deal with that later. I've also tried to develop, to my limited resources, you know, some kind of an independent response. I find that independence is a very, very, very great benefit, you know. I started my own little publishing company. It's a little company, but it was very, very effective. You know, the Jewish Onslaught got out there and sold like hotcakes, and it really made a difference. You know, just to have some kind of an independent medium. Didn't matter. It wasn't a major corporation or anything, but it was independent. I controlled it, and I was able to fight back to some degree. I think it's important too to have some kind of a support structure. I was very fortunate. They attacked me at a time when I already had established a pretty good sort of a support structure in academia. I was relatively well known. It wasn't as easy for them to destroy my credibility as it might have been for people who were perhaps less accomplished. But I found that having a support structure and being able to avail oneself of the support of that structure was very important. And finally, in my case, I tried wherever possible to take the battle to them. I didn't sit back and wait. You know, once the battle was joined, I found, in fact, I think in the early days especially, I think that they weren't used to having people fight back the way that I did. I think it sort of threw them off balance. You know, they came at me with all the usual, you know, bag of tricks, expecting me to fold immediately. But once I was able to fight back, and once it began to appear to them that they had a long, protracted struggle on their hands and not an easy victory, it took them a while to actually try to regroup and figure out what to do. So I just offer these as perhaps, you know, things for folks to think about in their response. Thank you very much.